Cherokee people, Cherokee tribe. Hey, I bet you didn't think that when you tuned in today, you were going to get a serenade. Well, here at History Unpacked, we aim to give you the things you need, but don't know you need, which is why you should like, subscribe, comment, and all that sort of thing. In all seriousness, though, that song is called Indian Reservation, and it was made famous by Paul Revere and the Raiders in the late 60s. And this is important because the late 60s and early 70s was really an active time in the history of Native Americans. You had the American Indian movement, a protest at Wounded Knee, which ended up with several people getting shot, I believe. You had the time that the famous actor Marlon Brando took Native American activist Sacheen Littlefeather to the Oscars. And you have today's topic, the occupation of Alcatraz. Now, some years ago, we did a video on Alcatraz and the prison there, which you really should watch. But in it, I mentioned that for a few years in the late 60s and early 70s, November 20th, 1969, to June 11th, 1971 to be exact, Native Americans were actually living in their own independent community on the island. And I also mentioned that it was maybe a topic for another day, and so here we are. It's time for me to make good on that promise. But before we really dive into this topic, we need to take a look at the broader picture of why all of the things that I mentioned earlier were happening at this time in American history. Another quick note here on the terminology. So from this point on, I'm going to be referring to the people native to North America as Indians. And sometimes this kind of rubs people the wrong way. It's viewed as kind of an outdated term, right? Kind of like referring to Asians as Orientals, right? But the reason I'm doing this is because back at this time, at the time all of these things were happening, that's how they referred to themselves, right? As American Indians. And actually, the term Native American, that only rose to popularity later. And it was mainly used by, academics and things like that. It was a term that really the Indians neither asked for nor really wanted. Actually, one time I was asking a Canadian guy I knew that was of Indian descent, and he's like, well, actually the best way is to just refer to them as the tribe they come from, so like Lakota or whatever, but you'll see that's not really going to be practical for this video. Nowadays indigenous peoples is kind of preferred. That's, I don't know, it seems a bit pretentious and it's a bit of a mouthful, so Indian is what we're going with today. All right, so what exactly was going on at this time during the late 60s, early 70s that made it such a hotbed of activity for Indians? Well, part of the reason was the civil rights movement, right? Like Martin Luther King, all that sort of thing, Rosa Parks, etc. That started in around the 50s, and, so this kind of sentiment was very much at the forefront of the American consciousness at that time. And, so that the Indian population, I'm assuming, thought, now is a good time as well to kind of start, making their voices heard. But the other thing here is that at this time, there was a lot of discussion over what was called the policy of termination. Okay. And so this was it was an official sort of, policy that the American government had towards the Indian tribes of the USA. And if you're like me, that sounds both surprising and kind of brutal, right? When I first heard that term, I had this image of, cowboys or, Civil War soldiers chasing Indians off of the land, maybe while riding horses and shooting guns and that sort of thing. And, you think to yourself, well, geez, I mean, it was kind of late in, American history for that sort of thing, right? Okay, but actually you'd be surprised. Believe it or not, the termination policy was as recent as the 1950s. And I think maybe maybe our viewpoint has been tainted a bit by the movie Terminator, right? When we think, terminate, we think of something very, kind of forceful and harsh. But the idea here was that the various Indian tribes would be integrated into mainstream American society, and they would no longer be viewed as separate, but as full-on American citizens with all the rights and all of the responsibilities, that is to say, paying taxes that come along with that. Now, if you're an optimist, that doesn't sound like such a bad idea, right? It's like, hey, sorry for the the hard times in the past, but we're all on the same page now. We're together. Come along and join us. Now, if you're more cynical, though, you can see some problems with that. Namely, you could say that, and many people argue this, that it was actually a covert means of erasing the Indian identity, of assimilating them, and essentially, that sort of thing. And that gets into the wider topic of, which is better, melting pot theory or salad bowl and this and that. Well, I'm not going to comment on that. I think you can make a good argument for either of those. But anyway, yeah. So, I mean, one of the arguments here was you're basically erasing their identity, right? The other issue, too, was it seems like even if you want to give the government the benefit of the doubt, it was kind of a ham-fisted attempt at doing this. And you were basically taking these groups of people that had kind of their own way of life for hundreds of years, maybe even, well, no more than that, right? And then suddenly you expect them to, transition to cities, start paying taxes and that sort of thing, which is really kind of like going from, cold water to hot water or vice versa. It's a huge change in difference, right? Or just a huge change in lifestyle. Anyway, the bottom line is it wasn't popular with the Indians, generally, right? And so, right, a lot of people were kind of speaking up against this and advocating for their own sovereignty. So that's why all of these things were happening. Okay, so then on to the occupation of Alcatraz. Now, so just a little bit about Alcatraz, so you don't have to watch our whole video on it. Infamous prison was there, where a lot of, infamous criminals like Al Capone were housed, generally inescapable, although some people did technically escape from it, though not very successfully. But right, and then in the 60s, it was eventually closed down and it was abandoned. So, what happened is there was an Indian, a woman of Indian descent named Belva Cartier, I think her name was. Belva Cartier, of the Rosebud, Lakota, and she basically knew of something called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. That was made in 1868. Now, the exact details of this treaty are kind of complicated, but basically, long story short, she thought that it was a strong defense for the fact that Alcatraz should belong to the Indians. So she decided, maybe this is a good opportunity to, kind of make a statement and that sort of thing. So she got a group of people together, like-minded Indians, and together they kind of tried to basically establish a presence on this island. Now, long story short, they tried several times to do this, and they had a few attempts that really didn't go as planned. But eventually they did manage to land on the island and create a pretty good presence there. Now, so I mentioned Belva Cartier was kind of the person who sort of spearheaded this whole thing, but there were a few other folks that were also there were various individuals that kind of were responsible for this, but some of the others were, there was a woman named Lanata Means, who I believe now I think that was her married name. Now, I mentioned earlier a bit of trivia, a protest at Wounded Knee, and that was led by a guy named Russell Means, who I believe was her brother-in-law. She later, I think, divorced and took her, I guess it was her maiden name, which is Lanata Warjack, which is the coolest name ever. But it was her. There was also a guy named, I believe it was John Trudell, and he actually created a he set up his own sort of a radio station on that, and he would broadcast a show called Radio Free Alcatraz. But probably the most important, well, I mean, at least as far as public visibility goes, is Richard Oakes. And, he was kind of a Indian college student at the time, and a lot of them, they were from various Indian tribes, but they were all kind of around the California area, and they were all kind of involved in the college, the university community there as well. But anyway, so yeah, he was kind of involved in that, and he basically became sort of the public face of the movement. And, why that is, I'm not really sure. As far as, my research suggests, he was just a very charismatic individual, right? Okay, so anyway, yeah, they managed to set up shop on this island, if you will. And, at that point forward, they really kind of got some pretty good visibility. Again, various other Indian people from the Indian community, again, lots of college students and stuff started going there. They even got some support from celebrities. I believe Anthony Quinn, apparently the band Creedence Clearwater Revival sent a shipment of water and supplies to them, I guess. Jane Fonda, of course, and I think maybe a few others, kind of supported them. And so they created this community on this island that they called Indians of all tribes, right? Because Indians from various different tribes were there. And it sounds like they sort of set up kind of, their own little self-sustaining community with, various people, having their own jobs and that kind of thing, and taking part of different things. There was still electricity on the island because there was a lighthouse there that they needed for maritime navigation and such. There was difficulty with water, and they did have to kind of get that shipped to the island, I believe. That was a bit of an issue. Right, so they were there, and a lot of them kind of created graffiti on this island, which I've never been to Alcatraz, but I've seen pictures, and apparently if you go there, you can still see some of the graffiti that Indians of all tribes set up there. So you might be wondering, well, what was the government's response to all of this? Now, first of all, the Indians drafted up this document called the Proclamation to the Great White Father, which I believe is still on record, and you can still read today. But basically, they said in it they offered to buy the island for a certain amount, I think $25 in glass beads and red cloth or something like that, which I guess the going story is that's how much America bought the island of Manhattan from the Indians. I've heard that's contested a bit, but anyway. So there was kind of some requests of them to set up, some cultural centers and just sort of museums and such to, Indian culture and that sort of thing. The government refused, but they also did not really act on it. They just decided to kind of bide their time and wait and see what happened. And you can see why. Nixon was president at the time, and, you can see that moving in and forcibly evicting the Indians off of this island, it wouldn't be a good look, even though, civil rights and stuff was still kind of in its nascent state at that time, they knew better, right? Okay, well, so what happened? Well, the same thing that happens when, look, okay, you've got this kind of individual community that's trying to live without the assistance of the government and so on, with everyone kind of serving their own role. When has that ever gone wrong, right? No, of course it collapsed. It always does. And looking at the research, it's not 100% clear why to me, but to me it just sounds like same thing that happens everywhere. There's different ideas about directions things should go in, clashing personalities. And then there were the hippies. You see, what happened is at a certain point, the college students had to go back to college. And then people started coming to the island who originally were, didn't share sort of the original vision of the founders. Some of them weren't even Indians, I believe. And yeah, things started to kind of go downhill, right? Now, kind of the nail in the coffin was when Richard Oakes, remember, that was the guy who was basically the spokesman, the face of this movement. His 13-year-old stepdaughter fell down a stairwell on the island. Now, keep in mind, again, this was an abandoned prison, and so there was all kinds of, derelict structures and stuff there. And yeah, so she fell down some, a stairwell and died. And, at that point, Richard Oakes, that he had had enough. I guess there had been too many tensions, and yeah, that was it for him. So he left. And so at that point, it was a pretty sharp downgrade. Things really started to fall apart. And also the American government had had enough. They decided to cut electricity to the island. And then some disasters started happening. Around this time, there was an oil tanker that crashed and leaked a bunch of oil into the ocean. Now, and remember when I talked about that lighthouse earlier? Well, the lighthouse wasn't working because the electricity had been cut. Now, if you look at some sources on this, it seems like most people agreed that the lack of the lighthouse was not the reason for that disaster. But at the same time, it kind of made people realize like this was not a good thing. There was also a fire that broke out and destroyed one of the buildings. And with that one, no one's really sure why it broke out. Both sides, kind of blamed each other for it, but it became clear that things were going downhill. And so eventually the government moved in. I think by the time they did, there was only like a handful of people, like around 5 or so people left on that island. And then the government, got them out of there. And then shortly after, they turned Alcatraz into the national park it is today. By the way, and one other kind of unfortunate thing, Oakes, he eventually ended up getting shot. He got in an altercation with someone, might have been race related, might not have been. I think there was, questions over whether it was in self-defense or not. But yeah, he ended up getting shot. So he's no longer with us today either. All right. So yeah, I guess they failed, right? It was a failure. Well, no, not really. You see, the occupation of Alcatraz, even though it was short-lived, it really did bring the concerns and the voices of the Indians to the attention of the government, and that combined with some other incidents. But really, the occupation of Alcatraz was very instrumental in this. Maybe arguably more so than some of the other incidents like Wounded Knee and so on. But it eventually caused them to get rid of the policy of termination. They had been thinking about it for a while, but at this point Nixon realized, right, okay, termination policy gone, and so they went with the current state of things today, where the Indians have their own land. That they're, where they're kind of given their own free sovereignty and that sort of thing, right? So, great. It was a success. They won, right? Well, maybe not. If you do any small amount of research, you can tell that life still isn't great for the Indians on the reservations. They just really don't have quite as many resources as they should. Lots of problems with crime and also integrating into American society when they choose to do so sometimes. So I don't know, was it a victory or not? Well, I guess that's up for you to decide, dear listener. Anyway, regardless of your viewpoint on it, it's really kind of an interesting part of American history that I feel like really doesn't get taught that often, but we really should know about, because it provided to be a very pivotal moment in the history of America's oldest residents. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully in the future I can maybe bring you a few more programs regarded to Indian culture and so on. But until then, thanks for listening. Cherokee people, Cherokee tribe, so proud to live.